Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Henry and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1984 when I was 18 years old at the time, and is something that all these years later I am unable to make any sense of at all. And truly I never imagined sharing my story with anyone, but your anonymous forum has given me the opportunity to speak out about the strange anomalies that happened to me while on a camping trip on the Appalachian Trail. I grew up in a small rural quintessential American town with two very outdoorsy parents who loved nothing better than to get their hands dirty, and so I literally grew up with a lifestyle of hunting, fishing, boating, skiing, whitewater rafting and mountain climbing. You name it, and I've probably done it. My parents had never intended to have children until much later on in life because they were desirous to go exploring around the entire globe, and they knew having children would hold them back. But when my mother finally discovered that she was pregnant with me, they put those plans on hold and settled down to married life. We lived in a rather small, basic, rudimentary-looking home in a rural neighbourhood where everybody else's houses, quite frankly, put ours to shame. I say that because although our house was a standard Mediterranean design, my parents never bothered about going to those extra lengths to inject that TLC into our home, because as far as they were concerned, our Spartan-looking home served one purpose alone, and it was a roof over our heads, and nothing less and nothing more. All the rustic countrified houses in our neighbourhood were delightfully enchanting, painted in bright, cheerful colours from blues to greens, apricots and yellows, all with wraparound porches and sumptuous entertainment areas, not to mention superbly mowed lawns and well-maintained front and back yards, pristine terraced gardens and exquisitely colourful seasonal flowers. Our house was the one in the middle of the street that was painted in a very dull blue-grey colour, with a very basic backyard, with a scattering of fruit trees and a bog-standard lawn. The kids in our street called my home the Ugly House, and that name just seemed to stick, like a label on a jam jar that refuses to shift, and I actually never took any offence to it at all. Growing up, I was surrounded by the intricate joys of nature, such as exquisitely mountainous views, rolling hills, silvery lakes, and endless areas of dreamy forest that literally stretched back for miles. I was indeed extraordinarily lucky to live in such a scenic paradise, and I never ever took it for granted. As kids, my friends and I were always on the street. We were riding our bicycles or playing in the woods or swimming in each other's swimming pools during the summer months. The 80s was a fabulous time to be young because it was an easygoing, carefree lifestyle with lots of barbecues, picnics and parties with the best music in the world. Crime was pretty much non-existent in those days. My father worked at the local school as a sports coach and he was always involved with the Boy Scouts, while my mother busied herself with teaching youngsters how to swim. So as you can see, I came from a very sporty background with a hankering for outdoor pursuits and adventures. When I was 18 years old, I decided to go hiking solo on the Appalachian Trail, as it was something I'd always envisaged doing, and I guess I'd inherited the passion for the great outdoors and for adventure from both my parents. Now I was seemingly old enough, with a plethora of experience behind me, that had well prepared me to camp on my own. My parents were not the slightest bit fazed about my safety, because they knew I was exceedingly proficient in my outdoor skills. My father had invariably taught me everything I needed to know about wilderness survival, from making a fire in a primitive way to hunting, fishing, and selecting edible roots, fungi, and leaves to eat, not to mention the edible insects that are also an excellent source of protein and minerals. My trip began on June the 7th, 1984, and I remember that day as vividly as if it was yesterday. I could feel a burst of adrenaline pulsing through my veins as I set off on my solo, trail-blazing adventure, armed with my backpack, tent, sleeping bag, Remington rifle, and everything else I would invariably need for my camping expedition. I felt like an ardent, globe-trotting explorer, and my heart was fluttering like a butterfly with excitement, because the idea of being one with nature warmed the very cockles of my young, exuberant heart, and I couldn't wait for my pilgrimage to begin. Fast forward an entire week, and I was in my element, surviving on my own in the mysterious, enchanting wild terrain, surrounded by mountainous valleys, rugged outcrops, and tall, imposing trees that created vast areas of natural woodland that were so majestic and enchanting. It almost took my breath away. That's how gorgeous it was. I loved the woods with the Spanish moss-covered statuesque trees that created the cooling canopy above my head, where shafts of pretty sunlight would dance on the forest floor in soft dapples of flattering light. Even the fallen tree trunks were covered with green moss, looked like creative, sculptural masterpieces of art, designed by Mother Nature herself. Then there were the elusive indigenous wildlife that was always surprised to see me, and although reserved, reticent and weary, would always regard me with a fervent curiosity, from the gentle doe and her spotted fawn to squirrels darting up and down the trees, the odd chipmunk, and even a lone coyote or two. The bird song in the woods was like an opera of chirps and warbles, and it was all so uplifting and awe-inspiring. There was a stream that meandered and zigzagged through the valley where I would invariably hitch up my tent for the night, and the sound of the gushing current flowing over the pebbly outcrops has got to be one of the most soothing sounds in the entire world, accompanied by the owl hoots and the chorus of crickets, frogs, and the distant sounds of coyotes. I can honestly say that never for a moment did I feel alone in this solitary, vast, impressive, and expansive wilderness. I had been hunting and fishing every single day, camped out in my two-man tent, under the silvery stars and the crescent-shaped moon, and I felt more alive and invigorated than in any other time of my life, until some strange, anomalous things began to happen, of which to this day I emphatically believe defy rational explanation. It was on a Tuesday night when I was hitching up my tent in an open clearing, and I was sitting by the fire pit enjoying some freeze-dried macaroni cheese and baked beans, when I suddenly got a very intense, precarious feeling that I was being watched, which left me feeling rather unsettled and apprehensive. I surveyed the area intently, but I could see nothing was there. I sat watching the flames dancing in my fire pit, wondering why I was experiencing this ominous, acrimonious feeling that seemed to cloak my entire being in a dark shroud of uncertainty. It was later that night that I awoke to the sound of rain pelting hard against my tent, so I looked outside only to observe that it wasn't raining at all, and that was when I discovered that the canvas had been stoned with dozens of tiny pebbles. I surreptitiously climbed out of my tent, and using my flashlight I scanned the entire area, and was almost sure I'd seen a shadowy dark form running through the woods. My first thought that someone had set up camp close by and was trying to scare me as a practical joke. I wasn't amused in the slightest, and felt irritated by such a jubilant prank, but I knew some people took great pleasure in scaring others half to death. I immediately decided to go and find out where these mystery campers had pitched their tent. I remember thinking to myself that two can play at this game, and I would give them a taste of their own medicine by pounding their tent with the very same pebbles that they had used on me, and we would see how they would like that, I thought. I gathered up the fallen pebbles and placed them in a large bag, and off I went searching for the mystery hikers, but I searched, and I couldn't find any sign of them anywhere. I knew someone had been intentionally throwing pebbles at my tent, so I felt very befuddled as to where these strangers were in fact hiding. When I returned to my tent, I could not believe what I was seeing. I thought I was dreaming. My entire tent had been surrounded, and I kid you not, by a perfect circle of the most massive boulders that were so colossal they would have been impossible for a human to manually lift without using mechanical equipment. In between each boulder was a branch of some sweet-smelling aromatic white flowers that smelt as intoxicating and enchanting as jasmine. Another extraordinary thing was that my backpack had been placed on a high tree branch, and it required a long piece of timber to push it off a suspended elevation so that it landed by my side safely on the ground below. I did not know what on earth was going on. I was muddled, bamboozled, and confused, but suddenly I felt so utterly exhausted that I could barely keep my eyes open. So I reluctantly retreated back to my tent and fell into a very deep, almost trance-like sleep, so overwhelmed by exhaustion that I was just too tired to contemplate the extraordinary things that had just transpired around my camping site. Who on earth had placed those colossal boulders around my tent, I wondered in horror. It was a very peculiar thing to orchestrate, and what on earth did it mean? Or was this all some hilarious joke designed to freak me out purposely, I wondered. The next morning I was shocked to realise that I'd slept until 12 o'clock in the afternoon, which was exceedingly late for me. I suddenly remembered the events of the night before, and to my amazement all the large boulders around my tent had mysteriously been removed, along with the strange flowering branches, but I could see traces of the pretty white blossoms sprinkled on the ground below like confetti. I also understood that my backpack had once again been retrieved, lifted and replaced back on the high tree branch. I'm not easily scared or ruffled up by things, but I knew I had to get to the bottom of this curious, rather baffling mystery, and I was convinced that someone was playing games with me, and certain that it was a couple of campers having a hoot at my expense. But the lengths that they were going to in order to scare me half to death was frankly rather admirable, if not at all very unsettling. That night when I returned to the confines of my snug sleeping bag, I noticed that the canvas was being showered with pebbles again and again, and I looked out of my tent and I could see the dark, shadowy form in the distance that had enticed me to follow him into the woods the previous night. I thought it was a human disguised in some strange black clothing designed to look intimidating, who was trying to scare me half to death and wanted me to follow him, and I was not going running after him at all. This pathetic joke had gone way too far by now, so I decided to remain in my tent. Before long I fell into a deep sleep, and the very next thing I knew was that I was awoken with the feeling of being unable to move. I believe they call it sleep paralysis. It was the most terrifying ordeal that I've ever been through in my entire life, because I was physically incapacitated and unable to move, which was utterly horrifying to me. I was never a believer in the paranormal, so I had no explanation for what I witnessed, but I opened my eyes to see this evil old shrew in a black dress sitting on top of my body and pressing down on my chest with such a brute force I felt like I was being crushed by a slab of concrete. I tried to fight back, but this evil old bag battered the life out of me by bouncing on top of my entire body like a trampoline, and I was unable to fight back because I was so paralysed. Finally she left, and then I came around from the horrific, mystifying experience, second-guessing myself and convincing myself that this had not actually transpired because it was way too bizarre for me to even get my head around. The following day I was almost certain that the decrepit, gnarled old hag and the sleep paralysis must have been a figment of my imagination or a really dreadful dream, but it had felt so incredibly real. But to my horror, when I lifted up my shirt, I had these telltale black bruises all over my torso, and one of them was in the shape of a small human hand. This freaked and discomposed me so much that I decided to hike further along the Appalachian Trail and find somewhere else to camp. I didn't fancy an encounter with a miserable old hag again, nor did I fancy experiencing that peculiar sleep paralysis. I was beginning to think I was going stark raving mad. Maybe it was because I was spending too much time on my own. I found a sublime place to hitch my tent in a remote clearing off the beaten track and close to the silvery zigzaggy stream that was surrounded with the most unique, interesting shaped boulders. I prepared my meal that night and gazed up in awe at the magnificent firmament of a glistening full ivory moon and a splattering of silvery stars. I listened to the chorus of crickets and frogs. It was such an enchanting night, and I felt deliriously happy being one with the natural world, and all thoughts of the previous night, bizarre escapades, had all but fleeted from my thoughts. Soon I retired to my comforting sleeping bag, only to find my tent being beaten with showers of tiny pebbles all over again. Oh, no, no, I thought, not again. I felt frustrated that I was being harassed in this way, and I unzipped my tent and looked outside, but there was nothing there. Then I saw him, well, the dark, shadowy form that clearly wanted me to follow him. So I pretended to follow him, as I was certain that this was some weird set-up or childish prank done by one of those hellishly annoying campers that I falsely believed was hounding me with those pathetic pranks. So instead of following the mysterious shadow back into the woods, I retreated sneakily back to my campsite. As I ventured ever closer, I couldn't believe what I was observing, so I took cover behind a large oak tree in close proximity to where my tent was hitched, to have a very good overview. To my absolute horror, I saw these Herculean-sized creatures that were so big, at first glance I actually thought they were bears. But these critters were bigger than bears, and were walking straight up on two legs like human beings. They were like vast towering giants, covered in long, dark, shaggy hair, with overlong arms and cone-shaped heads, with a very distinct gorilla look to their appearance, blended with very clear human-like characteristics. The first thought that came to my mind was that I had to be dreaming, but when I realised I was very much awake, the second perturbed thought to enter my head was, what in God's name are these creatures, and what are they doing? I watched in a stunned, stupefied silence as these incredulous critters lifted massive boulders from around the stream and placed them around my tent in a perfect circle. I promise you they lifted these boulders as effortlessly as feathers, and carried them in their arms like soccer balls, lowering them to the ground with such nimble dexterity. I noticed there were 3 of these creatures working together in haste and constantly looking towards the wood line earnestly, and I realised they were checking to make sure that I had not come back yet. One of the critters had branches of the mysterious white flowering shrub, which they placed around my tent. After the task was finally completed, they made these very peculiar owl calls towards the forest, as if they were communicating with someone, and then I watched them gliding back into the woods. I returned to my tent, feeling very gobsmacked by what I'd just witnessed, and what the heck was going on, I wondered in awe, and who or what were those creatures? I had never observed anything so strange in all my life, and why were they placing boulders around my tent in a semicircle in such a weird kind of ritual? It was all exceedingly odd. As I approached my tent and smelt that aromatic, pungent perfume from those peculiar white flowers, I suddenly became incredibly tired, and I could not keep my eyes open. It was almost as if I was drunk or intoxicated. I fell into a very deep, trance-like sleep, only to awaken later the following morning. The monstrous boulders had been surreptitiously moved away, and the strange white cherry blossoms all but gone. I started to reflect on everything that had transpired, and I couldn't make any sense of it at all. I decided to stay at my camping spot for a whole nother night. Once again my tent was pelted and bombarded with showers of pebbles, but I chose to stay fixed in my tent, and I ignored the thumping commotion. I knew that those creatures wanted to lure me away from my tent, so that they could surround it again with those mysterious boulders, and I didn't want that to happen again. I fell into a deep sleep, and once again I was awoken to the feeling of being completely paralysed and unable to move a single muscle. I looked up to see the evil old batty shrew pressing down on my body with her fists, as if she was kneading a batch of large dough. I was unable to move a muscle, and she began to pound me with such a brute force. It was so agonising. I wanted to scream out in pain, but I was paralysed. She was using even more aggression than she had on the first night that I'd encountered her. This evil, insidious, demonic witch looked like the grim reaper. I have no other way to describe her. She seemed to revel in my helpless despair as I was incapacitated and unable to fight back. It seemed as if she had rammed up the intensity of her attacks, and I truly thought I was going to die that night. I've never felt so helpless, so terrified, and so dreadfully alone in my entire life. The following morning I was horrified to see that my torso was literally covered with black and blue bruises and all the finger marks from that old hag. I was certain this devilish woman was intent on killing me, or finishing me off at least, and it was then that I noticed an extraordinary parallel. Every time the stones were placed around my tent, the hag never bothered me at all, but if they weren't there, she would invariably attack me. I began to realize that those mysterious, hairy creatures in the woods were actually protecting me from the evil old shrew with this strange ritual of theirs. This meant they knew who or what she actually was, and they possibly believed that I was in mortal danger. Suddenly everything made perfect sense to me, but I was exceedingly perplexed as to why these strange, curious-looking, humanoid, hairy creatures were so intent on helping me. They didn't owe me anything. Why did they care about a perfect stranger like myself? The following night, when the creatures pelted my tent with pebbles, I immediately obeyed the ritual and allowed myself to be lured away by the dark shadow, which I suspected was one of those creatures. I returned to find the colossal boulders being placed around my tent, so I slipped into my tent and into my sleeping bag that night, very comfortably, knowing that I was indeed very safe and sound. But I was awoken during the night to a curious hissing sound and a loud, piercing scream. So I unzipped my tent to actually observe the old bag standing outside the stone boulders. She was hissing at me furiously. She appeared to be incensed and incandescent with rage, and was kicking at the boulders violently with her emaciated, bony legs. It would seem that she could not cross the threshold to get to me. I remember getting a ghastly feeling that if she had actually succeeded in getting into my tent that very night, I would have not lived to see another day. I really felt certain about that. I watched this witch-like being with my eyes wide open, and I could sense that she was insidiously evil. Suddenly she dissolved before my eyes like a ghost, and was literally gone in a flash of light. The very next day I made a hasty retreat from the Appalachian Trail by setting out at first light and moving like the wind as fast as I could to make my way back to civilization. For many long years after the event, I pondered about what those creatures were that had saved me from the evil old shrew. When I returned home, I did tons of research at the local library, and I discovered that many people from all over the world appeared to have encountered this evil old hag during sleep paralysis, so I wasn't alone with this experience. I do believe she's a demonic entity who has insidious, malevolent intentions. It was only years later, though, that I discovered that those creatures I observed placing boulders around my tent were, in fact, Bigfoot. I think they have an extraordinary ability to tap into the supernatural realm, and they knew what the intentions of that hag were, and they used some kind of outer-worldly ritual to protect me. I believe Bigfoots have the ability to slip in and out of our reality, and I'm certain they understand the paranormal world and how to overcome its negative influences. They know things that, as human beings, we are obliviously ignorant about. I am quite certain that there are others like me who've had similar experiences, especially along the Appalachian Trail, but are way too terrified to share them because, quite frankly, the stories sound so far-fetched and bizarre. In fact, so much so, it's hard to believe that they're real. But I assure you this actually happened to me. And if others out there have had similar experiences, I beg you to have the courage to share your story, so that we can make sense of these curious mysteries that seem to abound along the Appalachian Trail. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Natalie, and I grew up in a small North American neighbourhood in a very standard symmetrical home that looked rather like a pretty doll's house from the outside, which was why all the locals in our area called the house that we owned the Dolls. I gather it was designed by a phenomenal architect of the time, which meant that every attention was given to the more modern styles of the interior living space, where emphasis was given to open-plan living, spacious bedrooms and sumptuous entertainment areas. We had a beautiful front and back yard that was always ablaze with beds of colourful blooms and large terracotta pots filled with bountiful displays of pretty, visually eye-catching flowers. My father at the time was passionate about gardening, as he always told us it enabled him to unwind and relax from the stress of the day after having dealt with very difficult customers. He worked as a manager of a large department store, dealing with customer complaints, inquiries and returns. He would describe some of the customers as so difficult, pernickety and demanding, which was why he believed his dark hair had invariably turned white after the first year in his job. My father was in charge of a small administrative team that dealt with all the issues that invariably arise in the store. But when they got out of control, he was the one always called on the scene to resolve the problem with the client. One of the customers who shopped at the store regularly was exceedingly problematic. She caused my father and his administrative team no end of trouble. She was a feisty elderly lady in her 80s called Mrs. Gwendolyn Harper, and she was always bringing back everything that she had purchased, like clothes she claimed were way too small for her, but were covered in briars, thorns and soil marks, as if she'd been wearing them on a hike or while she was doing the gardening. When she was told by customer services that they could not take the filthy garments back because they had invariably been used, she would claim that that was an outright lie, and that was exactly how she'd purchased them from the store. "I can't help it if you choose to sell soiled garments in your store," she exclaimed. "I tell you now, young man, I never wore these clothes. They came exactly like this." Then she would bring back jars of expensive cosmetic creams that had almost been completely finished and clearly used in excessive amounts on her rather crepey, withered-looking skin. She claimed that the cream had caused her to break out in hives. "Dreadful stuff," she would complain bitterly. "You need to swap it for another jar. This one was clearly contaminated. Has someone got their filthy hands into the jar before I bought it?" My father's staff members would assure her that nothing could interfere with the cellophane wrapping, and then she would say something like, "Well, then, it was clearly contaminated at the factory. You should talk to your distributors about such things. Now hand me another jar, dear." Sometimes my dad would agree to give the petulant, peevish woman a shopping voucher just to get her out of the store, because she wore down his jaded nerves like a rough piece of sandpaper wearing away at his resolve. She was such a cantankerous, prickly woman who no one liked at all, and whenever she came shopping into our store, every member of staff avoided her like the plague and pretended not to notice her, because dealing with her condescending manner, raspy, short-tempered voice was not for the faint-hearted, let me tell you. You definitely would describe yourself as having an off day if you dealt with the likes of the fiery Gwendolyn Harper. She would make the most even-tempered person pretty hot under the collar. I was raised by my two parents in our quaint little neighbourhood, with my older sister Danielle and my younger brother Frederick, and growing up we had an incredibly wholesome childhood because our parents were so interactive and very much involved in our lives. As a family we would go on outdoor excursions regularly and holidays, and we would go exploring and hiking in the Virginia countryside, or even further afield. I really adored West Virginia because it is such an exquisite part of the world to live, with stunning mountainous valleys, dreamy forests, rugged outcrops, silvery lakes, farmers' fields, and indigenous wildlife, and let's not forget, so much more. One day when I was about 13 years old and my dad was driving our family car on a West Virginia highway at the dead of night, as we were returning home from a camping trip, I remember my dad saying, "What the heck is that?" It all happened so fast as we watched this hairy giant-like humanoid creature. It was colossal in size and excessively burly and muscular, covered in long flowing auburn hair, and it dashed across the road at an uncannily fast speed, taking 5-foot strides. I observed it was swinging its overlong arms backwards and forwards. The critter turned to look at us for a very brief second, and that was when we noticed his human-like face and the red eye shine that emanated from his deep-set eyes. We watched the critter in awe as it literally bounded over the guardrail, down a grassy embankment to the wooded area beyond, and it moved with such a seamless grace. In that extraordinary, exhilarating second, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that we had observed a Bigfoot, and it was the most exhilarating moment of my entire young life. The first thing I remember my mother said was, "Wow, what a gorgeous creature. I wonder what on earth he is." As kids, my siblings and I were squealing at the back of the car. "We saw Bigfoot! We saw Bigfoot!" We were so ecstatic about our brief encounter. After such a surreal, scant experience, I had this huge yearning to have a one-on-one encounter with Bigfoot myself. I heavily researched the subject, much to the amusement of both my parents, who thought my fascination for Bigfoot was endearing. My mother reminded me over and over again that the odds of encountering a Bigfoot again were very much stacked against me, and I had about as much chance of seeing him again as winning the national lottery. I knew she was right, because by nature they're elusive and reticent creatures, so an opportunity of a decent one-on-one encounter with the ambiguous hairy man was indeed very slim. But even so, I wasn't going to stop hoping and praying that one day it might just actually happen. I did have a friend in West Virginia who claimed that she was terrorized by a Bigfoot on her property that kept pilfering their chickens and was exceedingly aggressive. But I assure you nothing she could have ever said or done could have dampened my enthusiasm and passion for finding this indefinable, bewildering, cryptid beast that had left an indelible mark on my life for such a minuscule chance encounter. Fast forward a few years, and by this time I was about 16 years old, and I took on a holiday job at my uncle's funeral home because he paid exceedingly well, and I could do with the pocket money. It would seem that the administrative assistant who dealt with all the paperwork regarding deceased estates had come down with a bad bout of pneumonia and had subsequently been hospitalized. I eagerly accepted the temporary job, which I did not think would be that difficult, as I was very good at dealing with people and answering phone calls. I rarely believed it would be a plain sailing and very simple job. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first week that I was in the offices, everything ran very smoothly, until it seemed that the funeral parlour was suddenly inundated with a large number of sudden deaths, which I gather sometimes does happen. It would seem that unfortunately, due to staff shortages, it invariably meant I had to get much more involved with parts of the job I had seriously hoped to avoid, like ushering in the frequent deliveries of dead bodies to the morgue for cold storage, and of course talking to relatives about the funeral arrangements for their loved ones. It was a very challenging time for me, because people all react to death very differently, and dealing with raw emotions is never easy at the best of times. It rarely felt as if I'd been thrown into the deep end of a shark-infested tank. One day, a very pretty auburn-haired, blue-eyed young woman who looked like a startled fish out of water entered the funeral parlour, and she told me that her grandmother was being autopsied downtown at the medical examiner's morgue because her manner of death was exceedingly questionable. "It'll be released to your funeral home later," she informed me, "once the medical examiner is finally satisfied with her findings. I just want to get cracking with the funeral plans, if I may." "Of course," I said. "Come this way." I gestured to the lady as she followed me into the office. "I know who did it," she whispered, "but I daren't tell anyone, in case I get sectioned." "You know who did what?" I asked the lady, as she sat down at the desk. "I know who murdered my grandmother," she said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked at the young lady in surprise, because it seemed to me so absurd that she would be keeping such a startling revelation from the police, and confiding in me of all people. I mean, I was helping with funeral arrangements for her grandmother. Why was she telling me all this stuff? I wondered to myself privately. "People think my Uncle Nell did her in because he despised her so much," she continued. "But I saw the murder for myself. I was hiding, you see. I saw the whole thing before my very eyes." "You should be telling the police this," I said. "Not me." "It was Bigfoot who killed my grandmother. Do you think there's a chance in a month of Sundays they'll believe me?" whispered the girl. "I honestly do not know why I'm telling you this, but I need to get it off my chest, and for some very strange, outlandish reason, I think I can trust you." When the lady told me that Bigfoot had killed her grandmother, I was intrigued, and I asked her to tell me absolutely everything. I could feel my heart fluttering in my chest with excitement, because this was as close to a personal encounter with a hairy man as I was ever likely to get. "Well, I can't really blame the Bigfoot for what he did," said the lady. "I mean, my grandmother was chasing after him with a pitchfork in the middle of the night because he was pilfering some of her apples from her trees, and she was incandescent with rage. You see, my grandmother is a very, very possessive woman, and she's as tight as you can get, so much so that she can't even bear to part with a few apples. She's that tight." "Wow," I said. "Now that is mean." The girl continued, "All I saw at the time was this colossal hairy creature running into the woods, and I actually thought it was a bear. My grandmother," she said, leaning forward, "I don't wish to speak ill of the dead, but she was a horrible, horrible, nasty woman with a temper on her that was so bad that even her own farm dogs kept a wary distance from her." "Wow, that's incredible," I said, "especially for dogs." That evening I reluctantly decided to follow my grandmother into the woods, because she's very frail and not robust these days. She's in her 80s, you know, and so I was concerned that she would fall over and hurt herself or be mauled by that bear she was chasing. Sometimes she has no common sense whatsoever. I mean, who in their right mind tries to antagonize a bear? But my grandmother was never in her right mind, so to speak. So I had to follow her in the woods, and I saw the huge creature standing there. And that was when I realized at once it wasn't a bear, but a Bigfoot. I was absolutely gobsmacked to see a creature like that out in nature. It was like the critter was waiting for her and was expecting some kind of interaction with my grandmother, which is incredibly peculiar because they're usually evasive and very elusive, from what I understand. But this one was behaving out of character for the species. I think he was so amazed that my grandmother was actually bold enough to chase after him. I mean, this thing was big, and when I say big, I mean colossal. It was covered in long, tawny brown hair, and it was like a humanoid ape with very overlong arms and powerful, strong legs, and a massive human-like hand, the likes that I've never seen before. This thing was easily over 1,000 pounds, I'd guess about 4 foot wide and about 9 foot tall, and it had a cone-shaped head and a very long angular face. I was terrified by this Bigfoot because, let me tell you something for nothing, you know when you're observing a formidable beast. This thing was enormous, and I sensed I was in the presence of a very dangerous apex predator. But my fractious, balmy grandmother was absolutely fearless and seemingly very aggressive towards the creature. She kept screaming at him, "No one steals my apples! You hear me? No one steals my apples! You hear me?" And she tried to attack the creature with her pitchfork, but she kept missing. "You are kidding," I said. "She did that to a Bigfoot. I'm not joking." I know this sounds exceedingly peculiar and off the charts crazy, and I can't fathom it myself, but I promise you that this Bigfoot actually seemed so fascinated and very impressed by my grandmother's courage. He didn't know that she was naturally a very pig-headed and confrontational person at the very best of times. The Bigfoot actually snatched the pitchfork directly from my grandmother's hands and threw it into the stream, and he did this with a distinct look of amusement on his face. I think he thought it was a big game. The pitchfork, I noticed, was being carried away by the strong current of the stream, and my grandmother, with her frail, wobbly legs, was thumping around in the darkness trying to grab the pitchfork, and she was nearly flying down the rocky alcove to the stream, but the creature caught her in time, because I guess he knew that she would harm herself and was about to fall over. "You mean he rescued her?" I asked in amazement. "In my book, that's not murder." "Well, the trouble is that the creature was so monumentally big. I think he was unaware of his own powerful strength, and as he pulled my grandmother away from the stream with such a brute force to protect her, of course, his powerful movements literally snapped her neck. Imagine for a moment picking up an ant off the ground. It's an easy kill with one of those tiny creatures. You just have to pick one of them up and squeeze them with your fingers, even when you're not trying to do so. Well, it looked rather like that. So that was how my grandmother ended up being killed by the beast, but I know he did not intend her any harm. So she continued, it would seem that the Bigfoot, in his efforts to rescue my grandmother from falling over the rocky ledge to the stream, caused her extensive bruising, which the medical examiner deems very suspicious. I naturally couldn't tell anyone the Bigfoot did it, because they'll think I'm completely loopy, and I can't risk that to my reputation. You see, I'm studying law at university, and I don't want to be typecast as a fruitcake. Well, why don't you tell the police that you think a bear actually attacked your grandmother, I suggested, and then you don't have to mention the Bigfoot at all. That way it would explain the large bruises on her body. It's a win-win situation for everyone. Your uncle will get off the hook as a potential suspect, and the morgue will put down the cause of death as an animal attack, which is indirectly true. Good point, she said. Why didn't I think about that before? After all, when I first saw the Bigfoot, I did actually think he was a bear. Good point, I said. Tell me, what did the Bigfoot do when he actually realised that your grandmother was dead? I'm sorry, I'm a little curious about that. The funny thing is, he seemed really quite upset about it, and he kept trying to wake her up. He shook her body very violently and even slapped her cheeks, and he did make a very low guttural whining sound, as if he was rather distressed about it. It transpired that he realised that she was deceased, so he just glided away into the woods, and, oh my word, when he moved was he graceful. He was extraordinary to watch. I saw everything very clearly, because, it was a very bright night with a full moon. I know the creature didn't intend to harm her, so it really was an accidental killing, if you like. Not really a murder. Of course it's not, and it's an extraordinary story, I said. You've no idea how thankful I am that you shared it with me, because I've always had a huge passion for Bigfoot, and I do not believe that all of them are hardened killers. I knew you would believe me, she said, looking delighted. I'm so glad to have been able to share my story with someone. I do feel so sorry for the Bigfoot, because I don't think it would have harmed my grandmother intentionally. But the trouble is, he was rough with a frail old woman. I mean, she did have a replacement hip last year, so I think he was oblivious to how vulnerable she actually was. Well, why don't we get on with the funeral arrangements now, I suggested. The lady began to give me details for the funeral. It's unlikely anybody will be coming, she said, suddenly wiping away a tear. Everybody hated the whining, miserable old bat, so I think it's going to be me, the casket and the priest, and pretty much nobody else. I'm the only one paying the funeral costs because no one wants to cover them for her, and I don't want her to have a pauper's funeral. That would be terrible. Was she really that miserable, I asked, that no one will actually come to her funeral? I mean, that's ridiculously sad if you ask me. I'm afraid so. Even her own children are happy that she's expired. They hated her with a fervent passion, I'm telling you. What was her name, your grandmother, I mean? I said, scribbling down the funeral details on a form. Her name was Gwendolen Harper. I know that name, I said. Oh, yes. I do believe that your grandmother was my father's most annoying client, always bringing everything back that she purchased with the most outlandish excuses. Your grandmother is the reason my dad reckons his hair went white. Why does that not surprise me? She laughed. A couple of days later, when finally the medical examiner had released the body of Gwendolen Harper, concluding that an animal attack, like a bear, had possibly caused her tragic demise, I was determined to have a peek at the corpse for myself. So when her granddaughter eventually came to view the open casket, I offered to join her for moral support. That was the first time in my life that I've ever observed a dead body. The lifeless corpse of the frail old lady looked like a vacant vessel, and she did look like a very normal old lady, although there were very definite skull marks deeply entrenched at the corners of her mouth, which gave away that she was usually most often scowling. I know it sounds strange, but something very odd happened while we were standing there in the mortuary. I felt as if there was a blast of freezing cold air that suddenly entered the room. It's her, said the granddaughter. She's here. I can feel that she's not happy. It was an experience that left me feeling incredibly unsettled, because I know I never imagined it. When I told my uncle about the cold air that entered the mortuary, He told me that he had stories about the funeral parlour that would make my hair curl, so I never asked him to elaborate because I didn't want to hear any of them. That night I actually told my dad about Gwendolyn Harper's funeral and that no one would actually be attending it because she was despised by everybody. My father was moved to the point of tears, and even though he never liked Gwendolyn, he actually organised for over 20 people from his staff in the store to come to Gwendolyn's funeral. So they all came along. The priest asked anyone if they actually wanted to speak, so my father took that opportunity to get up onto the podium to say a few words. "It would be a very sad old world if we were all the same. It would seem that God has made us uniquely individual, and we should be grateful for the vast range of colours that make up the fabric of the human soul. Some colours we may warm to, and others may be cold, but every colour is significant and supremely special, because in God's sight we are all precious and valuable, as is indeed our dear sister Gwendolyn." I thought my father's speech was absolutely amazing, and although as yet I have not had a personal encounter with a Bigfoot, I am still hoping. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Noah and I'm from Seattle, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1983 when I was 16 years old at the time. Growing up, my family lived in a high-rise, attractive upmarket apartment block in downtown Seattle that was sumptuously decorated with stunning upholstered furnishings, interesting eclectic art pieces, and cosy, vibrantly rich Persian rugs. The huge seamless glass windows in every room of the apartment overlooked stunning cosmopolitan views over Seattle. I would often stand out on the balcony and watch the world go by on the buzzing streets below. I would observe horns beeping and people bustling across the streets, hurrying and doing their level best to get to work on time. I often wondered what excuse they'd give their boss this morning for arriving late. Sometimes I would hear loud disputes and raised voices on the street corners as two people argued over a parking spot. And I would watch people lining up at the baker's to buy their favourite breakfast bagels. Even from our apartment block, I kid you not, I could smell that delicious baked bread from the delectable bakery across the road that was subtly reminding all the passing pedestrians that coffee and cinnamon bagels might be just what the doctor ordered for a hectically busy Monday morning. The streets were vibrant and colourfully alive with the energy of a very bustly, busy city, and as an onlooker I found it fascinating to observe the lively activity of this thriving metropolis. I was raised by my two parents, who were both professionals in the city, and so there were many times when I returned home from school that I was left all to my own devices. It was at times like these that I longed to have a brother or sister, because hanging out all on your own could be incredibly lonely. I always envied larger families who had brothers and sisters, because I falsely believed that every family was as cosy and companionable as the Waltons, but I was to discover in later years that this most certainly was not the case. I soon learnt to entertain myself when my parents were busy out working, and I became very adept and proficient at being on my own. We did not have the technology that people have today, like cell phones and tablets, but looking back, I don't believe we missed out of any of that. Life in the 80s was, I believe, much more easygoing than it is now, and in those days I rarely believe we knew how to take life in our stride, and I don't think I'm looking through rose-coloured spectacles. I remember I would sit back at the desk in my bedroom, listening to the radio whilst doing my homework, listening to the music of the day beating in the background. I say this without bias or prejudice, but the 80s music was without doubt the best music of all generations. The lyrics were utterly outstanding and the artists phenomenally talented, and so it was a wonderful time to be young. Both my parents were very congenial people, but they were quietly reserved and found it exceedingly difficult to express or communicate their emotions, either physically or emotionally. But despite everything, I knew that they really loved me. They did little things like expressing their loves in ways like taking me shopping to buy my favourite sneakers or treating me to a milkshake at my favourite cafe. My mother was like a female doe who possessed a very protective, serene nature and a very gentle spirit, while my dad was like a very big black and white panda bear, lovable, gentle, and exceedingly elusive. As a young boy, I sailed through school. I was one of those very irritating types that people just love to hate, because I'd always get straight A's without even breaking a sweat. I was exceptionally good with science and math. It was not long before I was offering my services to tutor other kids who were invariably struggling with their grades. On one occasion, when I was about 16 years old, I was tutoring a little boy called Daniel Dexter, who was a really cute little kid of about 12 years old, who had been battling with his math homework and failing miserably at school. Dr. Dexter, his father, was very concerned about his son's poor progress at school and his son's tumultuous challenges with numbers, and so he actually paid me handsomely to tutor his own son after school hours, which I did diligently, and I heartily enjoyed. It was not long before Daniel was acquiring excellent grades in math, and Dr. Dexter was exceedingly grateful to me for the proficient tuition that had turned around his son's poor performance at school. I was blown away when he literally handed me a wad of cash to thank me, which he took out of his trouser pocket, which I thought was exceedingly generous of him. He also told me that at any time that I should require a holiday, that I was more than welcome to stay at his holiday home on the Oregon coast. He told me he had 2 Latino ladies who cleaned and maintained the property for his whole family. "You'll be treated like a king when you go there, because they'll pander to your every need and cook you anything you like. You should invite a friend to go with you, because the place is breathtakingly beautiful, and you'll have a whale of a time. And better still, I'll cover all the costs for you." I was absolutely amazed at this generous offer, and I assured him that I would accept it when the summer holiday came about, which is invariably exactly what I did. So when my school holidays did finally approach, I accepted Dr. Dexter's kind offer and subsequently invited my best friend Donovan to stay with me at Dr. Dexter's holiday home on the Oregon coast. Unfortunately, it would seem that Donovan would only be able to join me at the house 3 days later, as there was a family reunion that he needed to attend first. I scribbled down Dr. Dexter's address for him and handed it over and told him that I'd see him in a few days, and that was settled. As the taxi driver took me down the long windy coastal road, where I observed the most exquisite postcard-perfect beachfront homes, obviously owned by people who were not short of a bob or two, the driver asked me what their number of the property actually was. "It says here," I said, extracting a note from my wallet, "the property number is 78, but apparently the sign is a bit damaged. But Dr. Dexter said I will definitely know the house because it's a distinctive red front door." "Oh, here it is," said the taxi driver, stopping outside an exquisite-looking home with a rather grand-looking red front door. "It says this is number 73, but I think it's number 78. I believe the edges of the 8 have been worn away by natural erosion, making it look like a 3 when it's really an 8. It's the sea air down here," he said. "It can cause no end of rust on signs, and it's easy to get confused by weathered numbers. Happens all the time in this part of the world." Thankfully, I got out of the taxi, tipped the taxi driver very generously, and gathered my suitcase and my belongings and made my way to the gleaming red front door, which I noticed, to my surprise, was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open and walked into the house, placing my suitcase in the entrance hall while I surveyed the magnificently sumptuous, lavishly appointed home, where no expense had been spared, as every room in the entire house was exquisitely turned out, with stunning marble floors, sweeping staircases, and huge picture windows throughout. It would appear that every single bedroom seemed to have its own bathroom en suite, and a balcony or patio that overlooked the most panoramic views of the breathtaking blue ocean. I could smell the salty sea air, and even taste it on my lips, and I felt incredibly excited to be staying in such a lavishly opulent but very stylish home. Wait until Donovan sees all this, I thought to myself happily. I knew he appreciated the finer things in life, and Mr. Dexter's grand holiday home most certainly ticked all the boxes. It was high living indeed, and who did not fancy a bit of luxury from time to time? And even at 16 years old, I could really appreciate it. I made my way down the large ornate staircase past some pretentious, very grandiose living spaces with superbly upholstered furnishings, gleaming oakwood antiques, and impressive fireplaces, not to mention interesting artworks, until I reached the enormous state-of-the-art gourmet kitchen. I was literally surrounded by a sea of granite and smart white wooden cabinets, not to mention gleaming French ovens with hundreds of gas hobs. Suddenly I noticed that there were two Latino women sharing a chuckle together as they cleaned down the large granite surfaces with a shiny buff. I remember secretly thinking to myself that it was impossible to make that gleaming work surface even more shiny. "Oh, there you are," I said to the two ladies. "I'm Noah. I've heard so much about you both." The two women looked up at me in surprise, and their eyes grew as wide as saucers, almost as if they were wondering who on earth I actually was. They both looked at each other with a strange, perturbed, rather confused-looking expressions on their faces, while they smiled at me very politely. I opened one of the large refrigerators and helped myself to a large can of Mountain Dew and proceeded to drink it, while the two Latino women gawked at me with shocked looks on their faces. "Sorry," I said. "Forgive me for being so rude, but I'm dying of thirst. What are your names?" "I'm Lydia, and this is Anna," said the lady, smiling at me awkwardly and studying me with a curious interest. "So good to meet you both. I've heard about your delectable cooking. I can't wait to taste your cuisine. I gather you're an amazing cook." Anna looked animated. "The boss told you that they loved my cooking," she said, looking suddenly very happy. "I only wish they'd tell me that themselves, because I never know if they actually enjoy my food." "Well, you know now," I said. I continued, "I can see by your expressions that you're not expecting me. But not to worry, it's all legit. I was cordially invited by the boss himself," I joked. "Of course you were," said Anna, beaming brightly, "and you're very welcome here." I proceeded to tell the ladies where I'd be sleeping that night. I'd chosen a room on the top floor, which was really, really beautiful, and it overlooked the ocean and possessed enormous glass sliding doors that opened out onto an expansive patio. On one side of the patio was a fire escape stairwell, which you could actually use to access the beach from your bedroom, which I thought was a first-class shortcut to the beach. I informed the kindly Latino ladies to expect another guest shortly, because my friend would be joining me in 3 days' time. So then, dressed in my swimming trunks and carrying a surfboard under my arm that I discovered in one of the bedrooms, I hastily bustled towards the beach, which was quite literally 100 yards away from the house. I found myself racing jubilantly down these smart white wooden steps that bridged the rocky alcove. When I finally reached the bottom step, I was invariably standing on this long expanse of beautiful golden beach that literally stretched back for many miles. It was quite possibly the most exquisite scenery that I've ever enjoyed in my entire life. All the stunning oceanfront homes appeared to be built on a high hilly elevation that was composed of masterful-looking rocks and dotted by ubiquitous tall evergreen firs that stretched out into personalised, individualised, charming gardens. The panoramic views over the rolling blue ocean with its impressive high breakers were totally enchanting. I also enjoyed admiring the masterful pieces of rockery that looked like great works of natural sculpture that jutted out into areas of the ocean. I knew that rockery was the perfect spot to locate those quaint little charming rock pools filled with all kinds of curiously interesting sea life, like sea anemones, starfish, and you name it. I loved the way the waves would crash against the rocks, forming bountiful foaming white bubbles, and the sound of the ocean waves was quite exhilarating and extraordinary. I glided eagerly towards the surf, drinking in the smell of the fresh salty sea air, and enjoying the feeling of the soft breeze blowing against my skin. As I ran, clouds of soft beach sand enveloped my feet, and as I reached the surf, it was wonderful feeling my feet getting drenched by the cool water of the ocean. Armed with my surfboard tucked under one of my arms, I moved ever forwards into the surf, gliding into the deeper water, where I bravely embarked on tackling a few of those challenging waves with my surfboard, with what I might say was a small degree of success. I was lucky to have been taught to surf by a professional instructor once, when I was as young as 12, so I was quite fluent with the whole surfing protocol and considered myself an above-average surfer. How long I was out there in the salty blue foaming water, I have absolutely no idea, because time seemed to stand so still. I was having that much fun, and I was in my element embracing those incredible waves. There wasn't a solitary soul around, and the entire beach was all to myself, so I was in heaven. By the time I'd finished surfing, I was aching in places I didn't even know I had muscles. I wearily made my way back to the house, and in the process I possibly brought the entire beach back with me, because there were sand trails everywhere, so poor Anna certainly had her work cut out, cleaning after the likes of me. Anna and Lydia attended to my every need, fussing over me like a distinguished guest, giving me the house keys and making me some incredible dishes, including the most incredibly sumptuous homemade pizza and a double thick chocolate milkshake. So there were times I quite literally thought I'd died and gone to heaven, and Anna and Lydia were angels without wings. "Who taught you to cook?" I asked Anna, who was blushing furiously with my passionate enthusiasm over her outrageously good food. "You should be running your own restaurant, not working for the boss." "Maybe one day," she said, with a longing look on her face. After 3 days had passed, I was surprised to see that Donovan had not arrived at the holiday home yet. But as we did not have cell phones in those days, and I didn't know what number to call him on, I decided to just let sleeping dogs lie. Maybe something had delayed his trip to the coast, and the family reunion had gone on longer than he had anticipated. That was very possible, I thought. That night I went to bed, aching all over from 3 days on the beach, overexerting myself on the surfboard. So that night I invariably found it very difficult to get to sleep, because of the inevitable aches and pains that were kind of keeping me awake. But I did manage to fall asleep, and I was awoken to the sound of raised, excitable voices in the house, expressing their fervent delight to be home. As I was partially asleep, I thought the animated, shrill voices were all part of my dream, until I suddenly heard feet racing up the staircase and rushing towards my bedroom. Suddenly I looked up from my pillow to see a young 8-year-old girl studying me with a bewildered look on her face, and then she turned around and dashed downstairs. I heard her saying, "Daddy, there's a strange, horrible man lying in my bed." Then I could hear the father saying, "What, are you sure?" I then heard the ominous sound of the man loading his firearm and telling his wife that the house had been burgled and the perpetrator was still in the house. "Call the police at once," he told his wife, "and I'll deal with the intruder." Wasting no time for idle speculation, I quickly grabbed my wallet and raced down the fire escape towards the white steps, down to the beach, wearing only a pair of boxer shorts, but it could have been a whole lot worse. I could have been absolutely wearing nothing. As I reached the beach, I had a startling revelation, and it hit me like a brick in the face. I'd been staying at the wrong house all this time, eating their food, ordering their cleaners around, and helping myself to all and sundry. It all made perfect sense now. I recalled the shocked looks on Anna's and Lydia's faces as I'd barged into the kitchen and helped myself to a drink as if I'd owned the place. I thought about the fact that Donovan had not turned up, but that was possibly because he was actually staying at the right house. Then there was the taxi ride to the house, and that we thought the 8 had been weathered away to create a 3, but maybe the house that I'd been staying at was 73 and not the 78 that I was actually looking for. All these thoughts were invariably shooting up in my head like fireworks taking off. I noticed that there were blue lights flashing in the distance, and I realised in horror that the police had actually been called to the house. So I scurried away as quickly as I could, climbing over several rocky outcrops, running from one private beach to another, until finally I found a private beach which was a little bit more cut off, where I felt safe, and where I found a place to sleep on the soft sea sand. I awoke later that night to feel something scuttling and crawling over my body, and I discovered it was a big crab, so I pushed it to one side. I stood up for a while and I glanced towards the beach, and then I noticed that the entire beach was literally crawling with large crabs that seemed to emerge from the surf from nowhere. They were the kinds of crabs every gourmet chef would want to serve up in their restaurant, and there were hundreds of these things, and they were big. I glanced at my watch and it was about 2 a.m. in the morning, and then to my amazement I saw the torso of a very large man sitting on the beach. I realised that this man was a very stocky build because his shoulders were absolutely enormous and his chest was easily 4 foot across. My first thought was that this man was some kind of extreme bodybuilder, but what on earth was he doing sitting on the beach at this time of the morning? Had he had a raucous row with his wife, I wondered, over his obsession with bodybuilding, and he was seeking refuge on the beach to calm down his frazzled nerves? Even sitting down, this man was exceedingly tall, and I was curious about him, so I decided to sneak behind the rocks that were yards away from where he was sitting to get a better view of him. I think secretly I was rather impressed by the size of him, and I wanted to see what his rack looked like. Luckily it was a full moon that night, so visibility was excellent, and the outside lights of the oceanfront house also gave phenomenal illumination. As I ventured ever closer, I realised that this strange man was covered in long dark hair, and then I observed that this was not a man at all. But what was it? I couldn't imagine. It looked like a man, but it also looked like an ape, almost as if they were rolled together. My attention was drawn to what this creature was actually doing. I noticed it was sitting on the sandy bank of the beach, breaking open these crabs with his nimble, strong, large, sausage-sized fingers, and eating the contents which he sucked out of the shell. He must have eaten dozens of crabs, because there was a huge pile of these broken shells standing by his side, layered on top of each other. This creature sat on the soft beach sand and appeared to be watching the waves crashing against the rocks, and I believe he was actually appreciating the view. I really got the impression that he was definitely enjoying himself. After the creature had eaten his fill, he rubbed his stomach appreciatively and finally stood up and began to lift his arms to the sky and reach out for a huge stretch. When he did this, I nearly fainted, because I never anticipated the creature being this incredibly tall. I promise you he was easily over 10 foot and 1,000 pounds. I don't think any man could be this big, and despite the long flowing hair covering his torso, not to mention his entire body, I'm willing to bet that he had the most phenomenal rack. He was such an impressive-looking creature, majestic, agile, athletic and lofty, and although he was incredibly intimidating, I did not feel a moment of fear. I noticed that every area of this critter's body bulged with muscle, and he had very impressive strong legs, and his arms were so long he could have easily touched the ground without bending over. The critter glided towards the surf, and I could observe what looked like a brown rock bobbing up and down between the waves, but he swam with such effortless ease, and the massive breakers were no obstacle for him to overcome. The creature glided out of the water and shook his coat of long black shaggy hair, much like a long-haired dog does when he emerges from the surf. It was then that I noticed the cone-shaped head, the long angular face, the very distinct prominent brow ridge, and the deep-set eyes that seemed to possess a red shine in the darkness. I was in total awe of this creature as I watched it glide away, and I remember wondering what on earth it was, and I knew instinctively if I told anyone what I'd observed, they would tell me that I'd been drinking way too much moonshine. At first light the following morning I began to look for house number 78, and as I knocked on the bright red door, it was opened by my best friend Donovan. "What happened to you?" he asked. "When I arrived here you were nowhere to be seen." He looked at me in absolute horror, standing there in the doorway in my boxer shorts, half naked in the early morning light. "I've been sleeping in the wrong house," I told him. Donovan gasped, with his hands cupping his mouth in astonishment. "Yes," I said, "I walked into a stranger's house and was waited on hand and foot by their Latino staff for 3 long days, only to discover in the middle of the night that I was actually sleeping in the wrong house when the kid discovered me sleeping in her bed, and the family finally called the police, so I did a runner before I got caught." As Donovan looked at me, he cracked up laughing. "Only you could end up embroiled in such a mess. Lucky for your parents they didn't answer the phone when I called their house after I arrived here, because I didn't know where on earth you were, because you couldn't be seen anywhere. You would have had everyone searching for you by now, and worried that you'd been abducted by aliens, he teased. To cut a long story short, I never returned to house number 73 to retrieve my suitcase or the rest of my belongings. For the rest of the holiday, I actually borrowed Donovan's clothes, and we had a fabulous time spent on Dr. Dexter's beautiful oceanfront home, which, although stunningly luxurious, was not nearly as lavish as the former house that I'd stayed in, and the Latino staff were not nearly as accommodating as Anna and Lydia had been, nor were they as exceptionally good at cooking like Anna invariably was. Years later, I told Dr. Dexter what actually transpired to me when I went to stay at his home, and he recalls actually going to a dinner party in Oregon where one of the guests talked about a strange visitor who had moved into their holiday home and helped himself to everything while his family was away. "The cheek of it," he had said. "The man clearly wanted a free holiday at my expense, and just barged into my property as if he owned the place. My little girl discovered the man sleeping in her bed, and he made a hasty retreat down our fire escape so that the police never caught up with him. The brazen audacity of some people just boggles the mind." Several years ago, I went to a delicious Latino restaurant in Oregon and was escorted to my table by a very familiar face. It was Anna, the Latino, who had waited on me hand and foot in that stranger's home. Believe it or not, she said that I was the best uninvited guest that she'd ever waited on, and she said my appreciation of her food had made her all the more determined to run her own restaurant one day. So she gave our family our meal on the house. So it's a very small world indeed. Years later, due to television and the internet, I was to discover that the critter that I saw stuffing his face with crabs on the beach was indeed a Bigfoot, and it was worth all that incredible drama just to encounter the hairy humanoid. So there you are. That is my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rolf and I'm from West Virginia. My Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015 when I was 25 years old at the time. I grew up in a beautiful traditional style farmhouse that was built by my father's brother, who is a master builder, who created us a sumptuous home that just looks so perfectly harmonious, nestled in the idyllic emerald green valley, surrounded by exquisite statuesque mountains and acres of dreamy forest, not to mention lily-covered ponds and silvery lakes. Our two-storied farmhouse has the whimsical character and charm of the 1800s home, with whitewashed walls, large beautiful French-styled windows, and a grey slate roof. The house has its own beautifully constructed wooden wraparound porch, with a vast area for entertainment that has been set up with the finest barbecue equipment and a built-in bar and sumptuous seating area, all decked out with cosy, colourful cushions. I adore this outdoor retreat because it overlooks a large silvery lake, which means you can literally sit back and enjoy the enchanting panoramic views and watch some of the indigenous wildlife frequent the area for a drink, from white-tailed deers to raccoons, and let's not forget to mention the most extraordinary bird life. To access our home, you literally have to drive down a long, windy dirt road and take a right turning towards a large farm gate, and then you have to drive down a long gravel driveway until you get to a semicircular paved area that has been neatly landscaped with hedges and beds of colourful flowers, and yards away is a grandiose stone staircase that leads up to our large front door. I was born in this house on the kitchen floor, delivered by my dad, as the emergency services had not arrived in time. I had decided to be born at once, without waiting for anyone. My mother describes my delivery as almost effortless, because I was coming out hell or high water, and by contrast my older brother Christian seemed to be very reluctant to be born, and my mother battled to deliver him. In a peculiarly strange way, the way we were born almost mirrors our personalities, something my mother is always so quick to point out. For example, I make decisions very quickly and decisively, and I'm efficient, systematic and on the ball, while my ambivalent brother agonises over every single decision he actually makes, and it's such a long, drawn-out, lengthy and tentative process. Even simple things growing up, like buying a handful of candies, would have him studying the sweets for literally ages, pontificating and wavering about which sweets to invariably buy. In contrast, it literally took me seconds to select mine. I remember my mother would become so infuriated with my brother and say, "For goodness sake, Christian, hurry up," she'd say. You're choosing candies. You're not deciding whether or not to bomb Pearl Harbor. I remember Christian had been dating his girlfriend, Vanessa, for over 8 years, yet he couldn't make a decisive decision whether to marry her or not. I remember him hesitantly going through a long list of drawn-out pros and cons, as if he was buying a car, and the family teased him relentlessly about it. Finally, my dad helped him by giving him a nudge in the right direction, by suggesting that if he didn't pop the question to Vanessa, someone else might just whisk her away from him. That thought terrified him so much that he finally proposed to her and is now happily married with a baby on the way. Growing up with a brother 6 years older than myself was surprisingly pretty cool, because he would teach me how to fish, hunt, and he taught me all kinds of stuff about camping and wilderness survival. The one thing that my brother couldn't teach me was how to date, because he was so indecisive and irresolute about women, which invariably meant his dating life was an unequivocal fiasco. I did not want to take any lessons from him. Yet my dating life, on the other hand, was not much better than his was, if I'm being blatantly honest. It was not for lack of trying, of course, but when it comes to dating women, I found it exceedingly hard to find the kind of girl that I was actually looking for. And while physical attraction is very significant to me, personality is absolutely everything, because I didn't want to end up living the rest of my life with a bitter, sour old shrew. And believe it or not, it happens to people rarely, frequently, and more than you know, because I've been witness to those kind of marriages firsthand, and it's definitely not for me. My best friend Carl is already getting divorced from a woman who ticked all the physical boxes. I gather at one time she was a prom queen. Needless to say, he was soon to discover that there were cracks in that seemingly perfect veneer. He told me once living with her was like being married to the Axeman, because she started beating him up with frying pans and cricket bats, and she bullied him tirelessly, exposing him to the very real world of physical delusion, which he believed had ultimately tricked him into marrying her in the first place. He admits he thought the wrapper looked so good on the outside that he was pretty sure the rest would be equally as delicious, but it appeared he was very, very wrong. Just because the chocolate is good on the outside does not mean it tastes good on the inside, so I had no intention of falling into the same old deceptive trap. However, I did not want to date someone with a face like a robber's dog either, but it would seem I was having such rotten luck with all my dates. I had tried all the dating apps and met some really scary women, and when I say scary, I mean pretty terrifying to say the least. I guess I was just having rotten luck. One girl I chose to meet on a recent date looked really endearing from her filtered photographs, but when I finally met her, I realised her biceps were bigger than mine, and she looked like she was lifting weights for the world's strongest men competition, let alone world's strongest woman. When I met her, she picked me up in her arms like I was a feather and carried me back to my car. I do not believe I've ever felt more emasculated or humiliated in my entire life. Worse still, there was an audience of bystanders saying, "You go, girl! Up with women's lib!" And everybody was clapping and whistling. So there I was, ready to go on my speed dating experience, which was being held in a bar in Charleston, which was not too far away from where I actually reside. So there I was, ready to engage in the strange courting ritual, and so for several minutes I found myself speaking to several women very, very quickly, and by the end of the evening I had 3 promising phone numbers in my repertoire, but I decided to phone the girl that had beguiled me the most, whose name was Maria. It was decided that I'd pick her up from her home on a Friday night and take her out for dinner to a sumptuous Italian restaurant in Charleston with an excellent reputation for its delicious Italian cuisine. I had learnt from Maria that she had a particular penchant for Italian food. She was an attractive woman with a seemingly rather endearing personality. So I remember arriving at her Charleston address, and I realised immediately that she came from a lot of money, but I detected it was very definitely new money. I felt a little overwhelmed driving up the opulent driveway to the palatial, extravagant Italianite mansion that looked so illustrious and nouveau riche. It actually made me feel nauseously sick. To put it mildly, the house was over the top in its grandiosity, and there were statues of the David absolutely everywhere, and even a few inappropriate David statues, including a David fountain where he was peeing the water with a strong current of spray into the pond, which, shall we say, was a wee bit intimidating. Every part of the garden was perfectly manicured, and some of the hedges had been shaped into eagles. I parked my simple-looking car against a couple of gleaming black Bentleys and made my way to the very grand, carved, highly decorated front door, carrying a rather bedraggled-looking red rose in my hand for Maria. The door was immediately whisked open, and I was ushered into a very lavish, deluxe, ornate living room where no expense had been spared, and even the silken upholstered, carved oak and mahogany furnishings were accentuated with gold leaf, and although everything was incredibly grand and swanky, it was really rather tasteless in design and in your face. Suddenly a man walked into the room who looked like a drug lord or baron, as he was very tough and beefy looking, with a massive rippling biceps. I noticed he was wearing a crisp white open shirt that with rolled up sleeves, and on his tanned hairy chest he was wearing some thick gold chains, and even his fingers were adorned with large gold brassy looking rings. I noticed his dark hair was swept back in a very modern hairstyle, and his broad rugged face was rough, weather-beaten and very thuggish looking. He gave me the impression that he was a pugnacious, belligerent individual who looked even more threatening than Boris the Rottweiler. Now that was saying something. It was clear to me that this was Maria's father, who immediately indicated for me to sit down and proceeded to pour me a tot of whisky. "So you are taking my daughter out tonight," he said, handing me the glass, which I drank quickly to calm down my escalating nerves. "That's right. It's just a sweet little Italian place in Charleston," I said awkwardly. "It's got a good reputation for very decent Italian dishes." Maria's father said nothing, but studied me ever so closely, as if he was sussing out whether I was a potential suitor for his daughter, and whether I was good enough. "What is it you do?" he asked me. "What kind of business are you in?" "I'm working as an associate attorney, sir," I said, looking rather uncomfortable. "May I ask you," he said, looking at me with such a stern look on his face, "what are your intentions with my daughter?" "Nothing, sir," I said. "I'm just taking her out for dinner on a date, just to get to know her. That's all." Maria's father looked at me and said, "Maria likes you a lot. Now you do not mess with my girl, or you mess with me," he said, pointing an accusory, warning finger at me in rather a threatening gesture. When he said that, his tone became dangerously aggressive, but then he suddenly turned up the charm, as suddenly as the control of a television set, and said, "Now you both go and have a very nice evening, will you?" Fast forward a few weeks, and I'd been seeing Maria much more regularly, and I was enjoying her company, but she was beginning to show signs of an obsessive personality type, which was exceedingly worrying for me. It was like every minute of the day she was texting and phoning me, always asking me what I was doing or where I was, as if she was checking up on me. When someone begins to hound you like this, let me assure you it is exceedingly frustrating. The only way I can describe it to you is that you feel a sense of claustrophobia, like you cannot breathe, because someone is squeezing the very life out of you. What was extraordinary was that we were not going steady, but she was acting as if we were already married and joined at the hips. The more we dated, the more possessive and insecure she actually became, and as our relationship progressed, the phone calls and text messages escalated at such an alarming rate, so much so that I began to switch off my phone. On our next date, I actually told Maria that our relationship was getting way too serious and going far too fast for me, and I'd like to slow things down a little. "You're breaking up with me, aren't you?" she cried out in horror. "I knew this was too good to be true." "No," I said. "I like you a lot, Maria, but I want to slow things down, that's all." Maria looked absolutely furious, and when I dropped her at her home, she never said a word to me, but sulked like an indignant, embittered, petulant child who was not getting her way, and she sat there with an ugly pout on her face. I dropped Maria at home and was beginning to realise that this relationship was not going to work out in the end. I wish I'd ended things then and there, but at least I'd made it clear to Maria to stop hounding me with text messages and phone calls. The next day I woke up to find that I had 60 text messages, all from Maria's father, saying, "If you mess with my daughter, you mess with me. I warned you about this. You better watch your back, because I'm coming to get you." I remember feeling very uneasy and overwrought, and over the next few days I was pretty certain I was being followed everywhere I went by a very dark black car, which was very disconcerting and discomforting for me, but I told myself I was imagining things, because the alternative seemed too dreadful to even comprehend. I mean, surely Maria's father was not going to act out on his threats, and have me followed. Of course not, I assured myself. That would be crazy. I had not heard from Maria, and when I actually told my mother what had transpired, she assured me that Maria probably assumed that I'd already ended the relationship. If you told her you wanted to slow down, my mother explained, you're inadvertently telling her, I'm out of here and it's over. I was relieved to hear my mother say that. I realised how good it felt to feel footloose and fancy-free again, because Maria had smothered me so much that I literally couldn't breathe at all. I decided I'd give dating a wide berth for a while, which was a huge relief for me, but the discomposing feeling that I was in fact being followed and watched wherever I went was very uncomfortable for me. But I kept telling myself that I was imagining things. On the Saturday evening I usually had the house to myself, as my parents would invariably go to a friend's house in Charleston to play bridge, because they were both passionate about the game. This meant I had the house all to myself, so I put my feet up in the living room and ate a pizza while watching Netflix on my phone until I realised my phone needed charging, which meant going back to my bedroom. Feeling too lazy to take the exercise to my bedroom, I just switched on the television instead to watch some sport and subsequently fell fast asleep on the couch. I was awoken to the very distinct sounds of tyres crunching on gravel. My first thought was that my parents had returned home. I realised it was rather early, as it was only 10 in the evening, and as I looked out of the window, I could see 2 men carrying batons and walking stealthily towards the front door. I recognised one of the men at once as being Maria's father, and I was in no uncertain terms that he wanted blood. Before I knew it, he'd smashed down the front door, and that was when I had no option but to run away as fast as I could. I made my way out of the back door and ran towards the woods. I'd played in those woods tirelessly as a young boy and knew where the great hiding spots were. I heard one of the men cry, "He's gone into the woods, after him!" I could hear their feet running after me at 100 miles an hour. I ran towards my hiding place, which is actually a hollowed oak tree in the woods that I discovered by chance as a child, and while it stands tall and proud, it has an incredible space where you can hide without being detected. I squeezed myself into the hollow as quickly as I could and stayed there very still, hardly daring to breathe. "We'll find you," I heard Maria's father roaring. "We'll find you and kill you. No one breaks my daughter's heart, you hear me? No one and walks away. You hear me, boy? I knew the second I laid eyes on you that you were trouble." My heart was beating violently in my chest, and my hair was standing on edge. Maria's father meant business, and he fully intended to kill me, and I'd end up being one of those missing people that suddenly vanish every year, never to be seen or heard from again. I did not want to repeat some of the obscene words that Maria's father was expressing as he and his friend started searching for me with their flashlights, lighting the way, looking through every nook and cranny to try and find me. But let's just say there were a lot of F-bombs being flung around. They were just reaching the area of the woods where I was hiding, when I could see Maria's father bashing the long undergrowth with his baton as he was searching for me. Suddenly there was this loud booming sound that was so thunderously loud it actually made the ground vibrate and shake, and this sound appeared to be moving towards us, and in truth it sounded like a herd of elephants racing through the thicket at 1,000 miles an hour. "What the hell is that?" I heard Maria's father say. He looked very startled. The next thing I knew was that this monstrous black shadowy form came thundering towards the 2 men, and was growling fiercely at them with its lips curled back to expose its white shiny teeth. There are no words in the English dictionary worthy of describing the creature that I saw to you. This humanoid critter, which I realised at once was the mythical Bigfoot, was unlike anything I've ever seen before. The creature was absolutely colossal. It must have been easily 1,000 pounds, 10 foot tall, 4 foot wide, and was covered with long, dense, jet-black hair. I could see this clearly because of the light of the full moon and the silvery stars, and for some peculiar reason that I cannot explain, it was actually a very light night, which was very fortunate. This disgruntled Bigfoot was incensed, volatile, explosive, and very clearly foaming at the mouth. He was that irate. Try and imagine an elephant in musk expressing rage. Well, the hot-blooded anger that this creature exuded was easily as intimidating, and possibly more so. The wrathful creature was stamping its feet in an embittered way and thumping its chest very violently, and it roared furiously at the men. I could see Maria's father and friends standing with looks of terrified trepidation on their faces, and to my astonishment, they didn't even run. It was like they were frozen to the spot like statues of ice, with eyes growing as wide as saucers and mouths wide open in an expression of unadulterated terror. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear to you that those two men sweated like pigs, and I could smell the fear in their body odour, and I was to learn later that fear has a smell, and it is a smell that I shall never forget. Suddenly the Bigfoot snatched the batons from the two men's hands with a look of appalled revulsion on his face, and he threw them into the forest where they landed somewhere in the thicket. He then throttled Maria's father and threw him across the ground like a soccer ball, where he landed on some soft ground, lucky for him. I watched him crawling back on his feet and staggering away like a drunk. His friend was literally begging the Bigfoot not to hurt him. "Please no, no, please no," he begged. The Bigfoot picked him in his arms and tossed him into the tall undergrowth. I could hear the man groaning out in agony, but he managed to get up and hobble away. I think he'd actually broken his wrist because his hand was dangling off his arm like a large skin tag. The Bigfoot mock-charged him again, and screaming at the top of his lungs, the man bustled away as fast as he possibly could. For a while the Bigfoot made some frustrated, rather indignant grunting sounds, as if to say, "Oh, those men are disgusting," and then he seemed to calm down, and I watched him glide away into the forest with a seamless grace. I couldn't actually believe that I'd seen Bigfoot. To cut a long story short, Maria called me and begged me not to lay any charges against her dad, whom I am certain would have killed me or beaten me to a pulp given half a chance. I told her that if he came anywhere near me, I would literally call the police and file charges against him, and I also told her that if anything untoward mysteriously happened to me, the finger of blame would invariably be laid at her dad's door. I also told her that the Bigfoot in the woods actually is a friend of mine, and he'll beat you up if you come near me again. Of course that was a lie, but I knew any mention of the hairy man would leave Maria's thuggish father shaking in his boots, and it seemed to have done the trick. A year after that harrowing event with Maria's father, and of course encountering the Bigfoot, I decided once and for all that I would never ever go speed dating or searching for love online. It all seemed so misleading to me, and I just didn't want to go down that path again. One day when I was shopping with my mother in the local supermarket, a young woman asked me if I could reach for some juice for her on the top shelf, and for some reason we ended up talking about juice and the flavours that we liked. I told her I knew of a lovely place where they made the best fresh juices, so we got together on a date. Well, just for a glass of juice, I suppose. And now I'm married to that girl today, and am exceedingly happy. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Tonya, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when I was 27 years old. I grew up in a very historic area of Arlington, Virginia, which is in a prime location only a few hours away from the Blue Ridge Mountains, Ocean City, Delaware beaches, and a couple of hours away from Philadelphia. I've always been thankful for the efficient transport and metro system we have here, but I personally tend to cycle everywhere because the city is very bike-friendly, with bicycle lanes and racks everywhere. I also live in close proximity to amazing restaurants, bars and shopping areas like Georgetown, and we also have 80 miles of parks and trails, providing the green space you invariably need in a town to escape from it all and enjoy some beautiful countrified scenery and fresh air. I live on the west side of the town in a neighbourhood called Lacey Woods, where you'll find your bricked colonial houses, your Cape Cods, and your custom-built homes. I grew up and still currently reside in a very traditional blue Cape Cod-style home, with a steep pitch gable roof and large central chimney, gable dormers and double-hung windows and shutters, and of course very simple exterior decoration, done in a white trim. I was raised as a single daughter by both my parents, who worked in the local Arlington area, but my dad tragically died when I was only 9 years old of pancreatic cancer, which, as you can imagine, was devastating and hit our family hard, like a bolt out of the blue, as none of us saw this coming. Suddenly my mother, who'd never worked before a single day in her life, as she'd always been a stay-at-home mum, was literally flung into the deep end of a shark-infested ocean and courageously procured a job for herself as a receptionist for a medical establishment. I remember her saying, "We've lost your dad, and I'll be damned if we lose this house as well, or our good standard of living." My mother clearly did her best to provide for our every need, and she rarely fought tooth and nail to keep the roof over our heads. When I was 21 years old, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, and sadly she died 3 years after her initial diagnosis, and to this day I emphatically believe that her cancer was caused by the devastating loss of my dad, whom she never fully grieved over, because she turned all her energy and attention to fight for our survival in this seemingly dog-eat-dog world. My story begins when I received a strange, rather peculiar phone call from my 83-year-old grandmother, who lived in rural Virginia in an exquisitely beautiful part of the countryside, surrounded by panoramic views of mountainous valleys, rocky ridges, silvery lakes, pasture land, and vast areas of dreamy forest. It really was a picturesque postcard part of the world. My grandmother was an exceedingly wealthy woman who had lived in her rather grand rustic farmhouse for over 50 long years, and she adored living in that part of the world and thrived on her independence and easygoing way of life, and never wanted her age to dictate where she actually lived. Imagine my surprise when she phoned me to tell me that she was getting married. I remember I nearly fainted in shock on the other end of the line, because when do you hear of an 80-year-old woman tying the knot? I was too stunned to say a word. I mean, what do you say to such a startling revelation like that? My grandmother proceeded to tell me that the gentleman in question, whom had swept her suddenly off her feet, was only 41 years old. Immediately I started to see red flags. I mean, what does a 41-year-old man want with an 80-year-old woman? It seemed very nefarious to me, and since my grandmother was an only surviving relative, I was incredibly protective of her. I hated the idea of some awful man taking advantage of her. "Oh, Tanya," she said, "he makes me feel so young again. He tells me that I'm beautiful and he treats me like a queen. We're just so in love." "Granny, I'm very happy for you," I said, "but I'm worried about the age difference between the two of you. It does concern me and trouble me a lot." "What's age, dear, when you're in love?" sighed my grandmother happily. Fast forward a few days, and I arrived at my grandmother's home to stay a few days with her at her farmhouse. I wanted to meet her fiancé and get to the bottom of this mysterious relationship that smelt more than a little fishy to me. When I arrived at my grandmother's house, she looked so animated and happy. I'd not seen her look this radiant in years, and she appeared to be going to great lengths to look as glamorous as she possibly could. And for the first time in yonks, she was actually wearing lipstick and mascara, and her grey hair had been dyed in a light blonde colour that really suited her peachy complexion and enhanced her pretty blue eyes. I noticed she was attired in a rather fetching pair of flowing white cotton pants and a rather swanky flowing tunic with gold and navy embroidery, which she wore with a snazzy pair of gold sandals on her feet. Even her demeanour had changed, and she was behaving like a giggly, infatuated schoolgirl rather than the mature, level-headed woman that she'd always been. "I cannot wait for you to meet Dennis," she gushed enthusiastically as she swept me into her living area, where I noticed a tall, lanky man standing by the fireplace with a glass of iced sherry in his hands. I want to tell you that the moment I saw this creepy man's face, I could feel my hair standing on edge, and even my stomach was twisting itself in knots, because on first impression Dennis was far from likeable. I noticed he wore a permanent, fixed plastic, insincere smile on his large baby face, and the smile never actually reached his brown eyes, which was awfully telling for me. "This is my granddaughter, Tanya," she said, pushing me towards Dennis, who shook my hand with a very limp handshake. It made me feel physically sick. There was something about a limp handshake that turns my stomach cold. "The two of you could be sisters," piped Dennis, turning up the charm, so that my grandmother flushed pink with delight. "Oh, don't be so silly, Dennis," she said. "See, I told you, Tanya. He's an absolute charmer," she giggled. "Isn't he so lovely, dear?" She clutched Dennis's arm very tightly. "I've found my Prince Charming, Tanya, and I've never been so happy." I watched in horror as Dennis put his arms around my grandmother and held her hand firmly in his, while he gazed lovingly into her Arctic blue eyes, and I was at a complete loss as what to do about these strange shenanigans, because this whole set-up was making me feel very awkward and exceedingly uncomfortable. I decided to hire a private detective on the quiet just to do some background research on Dennis, and I was to find out that he'd actually married 3 other elderly women, just like my grandmother, who subsequently passed away shortly after the wedding day, and invariably he walked away with all their assets, but the deaths had all been registered as natural. But I wasn't so sure about any of this. It all seemed very, very suspicious to me. One morning I observed Dennis, armed with a fishing rod, going towards the lake for a day of fishing, while my grandmother was visiting the beauty parlour and the hairdresser in the local town for a day of pampering and preening. "I must look good for my fancy man," she giggled. "I don't want Dennis losing interest in me, do I?" she joked. I knew that this would be my opportunity to confront Dennis head-on about his true intentions with my grandmother. I would wait for him to get settled down to some fishing by the river-bank, and then I would approach him and sit with him by the lake, while I expressed my misgivings about his relationship with my grandmother. "Hello there," I said cheerfully as I could, as I approached the river's edge where Dennis was parked with his fishing rod. "Have you caught any fish yet?" I asked. "Oh, no, nothing's biting," sighed Dennis. He looked very frustrated. "Well, it just requires a lot of patience, that's all. I hope you've got a good worm at the end of the rod. That always helps," I told him, sitting myself next to him on the river's edge. It really was a beautiful day, and the silvery lake reflected the tall trees in the water like a seamless mirror, and the clearing around the large river was surrounded by ubiquitous forest that literally stretched back for miles. It really was stunningly beautiful. "Dennis," I said, "I just want to get straight to the point. Why are you marrying my grandmother? Because I know it's not for love." "How do you know that?" he said, looking at me with a frown developing on his face. "Because when you smile at my grandmother, your smile never reaches your eyes. You're not in love with her, are you?" "How dare you say that?" he snapped. "What makes you an expert on love all of a sudden?" "Well, I know about your previous marriages to 3 elderly ladies, who shortly afterwards all just suddenly died, so that you inherited their vast fortunes. It sure beats earning a decent day's wage, doesn't it? It's good to live off other people's sweat and tears without lifting a finger, isn't it?" Suddenly Dennis's demeanour changed, and I saw a glimpse of the real Dennis, and believe me, it was far from pretty. "All right, I'll tell you the truth," he said. "I don't love your grandmother. She's a silly, pathetic old lady. They all were, the whole lot of those elderly women. I just turned up the charm, and they fell for my act, hook, line and sinker. And yes, I did help them on their way to the pearly city up in the clouds. Come on! They were all knocking on death's door anyway, so I did them a favour and just hastened the process. What's wrong with that?" Imagine my amazement and shock that Dennis was actually coming clean to me about the abhorrent, ghastly things he'd done to these poor women, by seducing them with his honeyed tongue and then turning on them like a boa constrictor and sucking and draining the life out of them. "That's disgusting," I said. "How can you possibly live with yourself, doing something so heinously evil? How do you get away, anyway, with murder? That's my question." "It's easy," chuckled Dennis. "When they're old and they pass away, people always assume it's a natural death, and the death certificate is signed without any raised eyebrows, and nobody suspects a thing." "How did you kill them?" I asked. "With a bag over the head," said Dennis. "It was very humane and very quick, and none of them suffered." "So is that what you're intending to do with my grandmother, once you're married?" I asked. "Your grandmother's case is slightly different," said Dennis, turning towards me with a big grin developing on his face. "There, of course, is one big stumbling block. And that just happens to be you. You see, your grandmother is so intent on leaving you her vast fortune. And we can't have that, can we? You've made my life very easy today, as it would seem that the hunter has come to the hunted. A sudden drowning is not going to raise any suspicions. Your grandmother will come back from her preening session to find her sweet little granddaughter floating there in the water, and she'll assume that it was a very dreadful accident, and then she'll alter her will and leave her fortune to me. You're going to kill me so that you can get my grandmother's money, I said, raising myself off the ground in an attempt to run away. Dennis had his firm hand attached to my ankle, and I couldn't escape his powerful clutches. I did my very best to release my leg from his powerful grip. "Let go of me," I screamed. "Let go now! Now! Let go of my leg! Let go!" Before I knew it, Dennis grabbed my slight body and threw me over his shoulder, kicking and screaming as he waded into the water. "Put me down! Put me down!" I was shrieking at the top of my lungs. "Help! Help! Help!" But I knew that no one would ever hear my frantic calls, because the area was very remote, without a solitary soul in sight. In that second I knew I was facing my imminent demise, and in that moment it seemed to last for a lifetime, as my life flashed before me in a series of visual photographs. The next thing I knew was that Dennis was throttling my neck and submerging my head beneath the water and holding me down with such a brute force. I remember wriggling with every last bit of energy that was left in my body as I tried to hold my breath under the water, and I kicked Dennis as hard as I could with my legs. I could hear him say, "Die, bitch! Die! Die!" I could rarely feel my life fading away from me, but it was not an unpleasant feeling, as you might suspect. I felt almost as if I was floating above my body for a moment and looking down on myself, and I felt surprisingly detached to my body as I observed Dennis submersing me. It was almost as if I was observing a movie, as weird as it sounds, and the person who was being dunked under the water was a character in the strange plot. It was a very liberating sensation that almost felt like flying. So I do not think the act of dying is actually that bad, really. It really was quite beautiful, because I enjoyed the light feeling that enveloped me, that was surrounded by such a warm, infinite love that seemed to be connected to almost everything. Suddenly Dennis released his grip from me, and I rose from the water, coughing and spluttering. I could see Dennis was being tackled by this huge, monstrous creature in the water, whom clearly had come to my rescue in response to my frantic cries for help. I could tell the creature was very angry as his lips curled back to reveal a full set of human-like teeth that were very white. The creature let out the most ferocious roar and proceeded to tackle the terrified Dennis. I knew at once that the creature was a Bigfoot, although I'd always believed them to be a creature of fiction, but this critter was very definitely real, and I knew that this strange creature had literally come to my rescue. I know they describe Bigfoots as large creatures, but only until you've actually physically encountered the creature for yourself can you truly appreciate the colossal girth, depth and size of these animals. The Bigfoot that just rescued me from Dennis was easily 11 foot tall, 1,000 pounds, and 5 foot wide. He was incredibly powerful, lofty and graceful. It was covered in long, tawny brown hair and had powerful legs, overlong arms, and very expansive, broad shoulders that supported a very distinct cone-shaped head, and every part of this gargantuan Bigfoot literally rippled with muscle definition. Dennis was running from the creature in the water and even tried to dive under the water to swim away from the Bigfoot, but it grabbed him with effortless ease with his powerful overlong arms. I must confess that he looked like a pathetically puny doll in the Bigfoot's muscular arms. I watched in a stupefied silence as the creature plunged and submersed Dennis's head beneath the water. He shook it violently with his firm arms. I think he was dishing out a taste of his own medicine and doing to Dennis exactly what he'd done to me. Dennis was kicking violently, but after a while the kicking subsided and finally ceased to wiggle at all. And then he became limp, and I knew he was drowned. Then he floated down the water, and he was dead. The creature kicked the dead body angrily with his powerful lanky thigh, making a low guttural sound in his throat, and then he looked up at me with bright, warm, friendly eyes and a look of concern, as if he was saying, "I got rid of him for you. Are you sure you're all right?" I was still standing in the water, shivering violently from the horror of what had transpired. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for saving my life." I think the creature understood. He moved towards me and put his arms around me and carried me back to my grandmother's home. Then he put me down on the front porch, and for a while we stood staring at each other, and I could feel the warmth coming from the creature's eyes. It made a couple of strange chattering sounds, as if it was saying goodbye, and then I watched it glide away into the woods with such a seamless grace. I naturally never ever told my grandmother about anything that had transpired, because I invariably wanted to protect the Bigfoot who rescued me, especially from the military, because I gather the military go after Bigfoots that kill people. But this Bigfoot saved me, and I didn't want him to be killed by the military. I could never ever have allowed that to happen to a creature who saved my life. My grandmother was concerned that Dennis had not returned to the house after his fishing excursion, and was sure he'd drowned in a freak accident. I never said a word until a few days later, when Dennis's body was finally recovered further down the river, and it appeared to have been half eaten by wild animals by that stage, and it was bloated and unseemly. I'm glad to tell you that it was registered as an accidental drowning, and my grandmother was very sad about the whole affair. I decided not to tell her anything about what happened, or what a snake in the grass Dennis actually was, because he'd brought her for a very short time a great deal of happiness, and I didn't want to contaminate those memories or cause her unnecessary distress. I remember she organised a funeral for Dennis. Using his address book, she contacted everybody who knew him, but my grandmother and I were the only people in attendance at his funeral, which I actually think speaks volumes as to what kind of a man he actually was. I remember my grandmother saying how odd it was that no one had turned up for Dennis's funeral, because she'd phoned everybody in his address book. "How sad," she said. "He was such a lovely, lovely man. Aren't people strange?" Sadly, my grandmother did pass away in about 2018, very peacefully in her sleep, I might say. And although I know I'll miss her incredibly much, I am so glad that she left the earth plane in such a peaceful way, and not at the hands of a guileful, evil man who was pretending to be her lover. I'm also exceedingly thankful to be alive myself, as you can imagine, because I know things could have turned out very differently for me if it wasn't for that Bigfoot who rescued me from drowning. I was so close to the end, so I owe my life to him. There you are. That's my story. Tanya, I don't know what to say. What an incredible story. And wow. And it's amazing that you were able to actually see through that guileful man and his intentions with your grandmother. And to think that you were rescued by Bigfoot yourself. What an extraordinary story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.